going to talk about the twin stations and the 100-year history and the 40 years that they were here in Grapevine. At that tower there. For 40 years, this building marked the southeast corner of the town. And it was the transmitter and antenna that sends us 50,000 watt signal across most of the U.S. And as she said, their dad ran the place. It was very unusual that there are actually two stations at that location. They both shared the same frequency, and how this all worked is one of the things we'll go into. But let's start back at the beginning in the 1920s. Well, let's start back. Your dad was born in 1906, right?
Yes.
That's correct. He was born in Arlington, Texas, to Matt and A.C. Barnes.
Yep. And
his dad was the postmaster in Arlington a number of years, and he did.
And the mayor.
And the mayor of Arlington. Now, I don't know what years that was, but it was.
As long as I can remember.
Like Jerry can remember. I don't need to remember because I wasn't born then. So, Dad met my mother, who was Willingham, and Henry and Frank Willingham lived over on Worth Street. That's how he got associated with the city, with Grapevine when they moved out here. And they had a house just two houses up from where the Willinghams lived.
My mother was Catherine Willingham, and she met Dad when Dad came out to Grapevine to work on the building of the radio station. He rented a room from my mom, Papa Willingham, and that's where he met my mother, you might say, and the spark developed.
Well, being born in 1906, he was actually born at the very start of broadcasting radio. It was in December of 1906 that the first, what's considered broadcast, happened on Christmas Eve. So he really, really grew up with radio in his blood in a way, but not radio as we know it today or even back then. It was purely, back in the teens and 20s, a thing where individual people could put together a receiver or a transmitter, kind of like what we would call ham radio today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
The forerunner of ham radio.
You couldn't just go down and buy a radio at those days. You had to build one. And it wasn't radio as we would know it today. It was called spark gap. And it was sounded like static, and it was keyed with a key on and off. So you got a burst, and then it was silent.
Morse code.
And that was the way the code was originally developed. It was quite a long time before audio or voice was developed for radio.
I think Dad had he got his ham license or started messing with ham radios before World War I. Isn't that correct?
Well,
I had what's called a QSL card. This was a card that if you made the contact with an amateur radio station, they would send you a card saying that they heard you, and then you could get one back from them. And I have one from Dad to a guy in Dallas, dated 1922, and that's the earliest I can trace him back to actually being on the air in the radio. A little other story that he always told, he was active in radio when World War I broke out. Well, the first thing the federal government did was shut down all the radio stations in the United States because they were afraid of the sabotage and propaganda and so forth. So there was a while there before they had any radio at all. So my dad was still active, and he had a ham radio station. And he had it, the antennas were strung between two telephone poles. This was when he was in Arlington, and he came home one afternoon and found out his antennas were laying on the ground, and he asked his mother what happened. She said, well, some federales come out here, and they said you operate the radio station here against the rules, and they cut down your telephone poles and dropped your antenna onto the ground. Well, Dad was not very happy with that. Wasn't much he could do about it.
Well, in 1920, at the end of the war, as the war had finished, all these single stations, these ham operators, these individual guys, some of them started to get fancier kits, and some of them started to build microphones and things like that. And so in the very early years of the 20s, something that would become broadcasting, not just one guy talking to another with a Morse code key, but one station broadcasting to everybody in the town, started to take shape. In this area, the very first station was WRR, which got licensed and went on the air in August of 1921, is the way they figure it. And the next year, it was followed closely by the two stations we're going to talk about, WFAA and WBAP. It was a fad. It was a big fad in the early 20s, kind of like computers or iPhones or something like that. It was the cool tech that people were interested in at that time. And did I go one past 20? I did. Yes, it does that. So one of the things that happened was the publishers of both the major papers, George Dealey of the Dallas Morning News and Eamon Carter of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, started to have to write about this in their papers, and they looked at it and said, well, maybe we ought to get in on this. Maybe we ought to start a little radio broadcasting thing of our own. Maybe it'll catch on. Maybe it'll help us sell papers. Who knows? So he assigned his son to it, and Eamon Carter assigned a man named Harold Hoff to it. And they both were told to put a little station on the air as cheaply as possible and see if anybody would tune in. And they did. The people did tune in. In 1922, both stations went on the, it's going to do that all night, isn't it? Okay. Both stations went on the air. WBAP went on the air first, May 2nd, 1922, and WFAA went on the air in June 26th, just a month ago and 100 years ago. Now, those call letters, in case you're wondering, do you know what they stand for? Okay, somebody...
We bring a program.
Technically, no. Technically, they don't stand for anything. The actual radio commissioner at the time said, well, you could say it means we'll be at the party. We believe all people was another suggestion. And we bring a program. But they were really just kind of assigned in somewhat chronological order, so they didn't actually mean anything. Similarly, WFAA most commonly is known as Working for All Alike, but it was also called World's Finest Air Attraction for a while. But it wasn't the world's finest at the start. It was very simple. That's the entire radio station on top of the Dallas Morning News basically on a roof in a shack in 1922. And that gentleman is reading one of the papers to go out over the airwaves. Stations didn't stay on the air very long. The technology was so primitive. We didn't have networks because there was no technical ability. There was very little way to play music or anything like that. You could take a Victrola and stick one of those telephone mics up to the horn and play it. But there were also only two frequencies. There was one kind of for news, more or less, and one kind of for entertainment. And every station had to be on one of those frequencies. So none of the stations were on the air for very long. They'd go on for a few hours, go off, let another station go on the air, and then they'd go off, and another station would go on the air, and they just kind of popped all around the place. And part of the great fun of the very first years of old-time radio, in the 20s, was that anything was possible. This is 1922, just very shortly as WFAA was coming on the air. And they actually did a wedding over the air. Just as a stunt. Could we do it? Yes. The bride was on WRR, the groom was on WFAA, and the preacher was on another station called WDAO. And that station only survived for 2 years, and the marriage only lasted another year past that. But they actually did their ceremony. It'd be like Zoom today. Yeah, all remotely, all together, and however many thousands of people could tune in and hear that. So, both stations started, as I said, oh yeah, let's go to that one. Most of the fun of radio in the very early 20s was just seeing who you could hear and how far you could hear. This telegram that I have had for many years came to WRR back from McKinney saying, oh, we can hear you. We can hear you all the way up in McKinney. That's pretty cool when you're sounding good, because they're playing Ted Lewis. It was an old musician, jazzy kind of musician, and they liked the imitation of Ted Lewis. But it was just how far you could reach. WBAP, for instance, claimed in that postcard that they had been picked up as far away as Honolulu in the 20s. And the stations were so tiny then that that's a real achievement. But then we didn't have much competition for electromagnetic waves. So there's very little left to us today from the 20s of what radio sounded like back then. Remarkably, we do have one recording of WBAP on the air in the 1920s, basically. It's this gentleman on the left, that's Harold Hoff. Now, you weren't supposed to use your name in the very first few years of radio as an announcer. It was considered uncouth. You'd use your initials, HH. So he was known as the hired hand. And he became very popular. And the station did too. If you look what's on that stand over there, so if I use this, right there, and I think that's another one there, it's a cowbell. And WBAP used to ring that cowbell when they turned on the transmitter and go on the air. And that became identifiable across the nation. Harold Hoff and the hired hand and his cowbell. The microphone is this thing right here, and the piano. And this is the second floor of the old Star Telegram building, right next to Eamon Carter's offices. The antenna was literally strung across the street, kind of a fancy version of 2 poles. So we do have a recording. He went up to Kansas City for a radio convention, and there was a station up there, I want to say WDAF if I've got it right, and he invited all the famous announcers of 1925 to come and give their sign-offs before his station went off the air, and somebody recorded it.
And this, my friends, concludes our program over radio. WBAP, the Star Telegram, Fort Worth, Texas, for tonight. For your time and attention and patience, we thank you. It is now about 10 o'clock and 10 seconds, Central Standard Time. Goodbye, everybody. For your time and attention and patience, we thank you. It is now about 10 o'clock and 10 seconds, Central Standard Time. Goodbye, everybody.
Technology started getting better, especially, and everything that was being tried as experiments, programming-wise, started to evolve into some radio that we know. Now this, for instance, it's about 1928. That's WFAA. They were now in the Baker Hotel. You can see the microphone on the pedestal. You can see another mic right there, and a ubiquitous piano for all the local talent. Grapevine musicians were on the radio in the mid-20s. The Grapevine Municipal Band started playing on the air in 1925. They would trek down to the studio. This on the left is a super sophisticated, super simple radio set from about 1928. Okay, it looks strange to us, but if you work it out, it's got a dial for volume, a dial for frequency for tuning in, a switch, and that's the speaker on the top, and it has this new feature called plugging it into the wall for electricity. which made it very simple. Similarly, the telephone lines were starting to come into place to make the networks happen. So we started getting network broadcasting, and WFAA was one of the pioneers of getting the networks around. To go with it, the transmitters from the stations were getting more powerful. This is WFAA, Dallas, on the left, and WBAP, Fort Worth, on the right. This is their antenna for transmitting in the 20s downtown. Both of them, I think this one's off the Baker Hotel at the time, and that's the Star Telegram building down there in Fort Worth. How am I doing?
Doing great.
Okay, good. Due to the explosive growth, the network, and I went past one again. By 1928 and 29, radio was starting to take shape into what was called the golden age of radio. Things like Amos and Andy and network shows were starting to happen. Power was increasing. The trouble was there were still only a few channels that you could put radio stations onto. And in 1928 and 1929, the government started to rewrite the rules for all this, to try to make some sense, to try to stabilize this growth that had happened. Some people in 1929 were predicting the future. That guy there is watching a television set, a projected television set that people might watch in the future. He was way ahead of his time, had 3 channels on it and color. And that's about as big as the picture they figured we could get in 1928. But some people were thinking that way. Well, by this time, WFAA and WBAP were both on one key frequency. You know what WBAP is on today, right? Does anybody know the number? 820, right. It was, back then it was 800, almost the same spot, but it became 820. And they were actually having to go on and off the air still. They both liked that frequency. They both were assigned that frequency, and so they both had to alternate their broadcast day. One would go for a few hours, then turn off, and the other one would power up and go on for a few hours, and then they'd turn off. And so the stations had to alternate like that for a little while longer. It was going to change, but not quite yet. First of all, Mr. Dealey of the morning news decided he had to make a big splash. Radio definitely was here to stay. He decided he needed to make a bigger, more powerful station. He selected a spot in between Dallas and Fort Worth, right up there, a little town called Grapevine. It was nicely located. It was a lot of flat land. There was nothing near it. And in fact,
All cotton fields.
all cotton fields, yeah. If you look at this map, there's not a road to it. There's nothing here. There is what would become sort of 30 and 183, and well, I guess that's 30 going across. There is the train from Fort Worth, but there's nothing here. So it's a perfect spot. Nobody would be worried if he built a huge transmitter and a huge set of antennas. What was your dad doing, by the way, in
He
1929?
was in college.
He-
He was in college at
Yeah.
Arlington State. Or he could have been SMU. He went to 3 different colleges. He went to Arlington State,
No.
Rice, and then SMU one.
Rice is 1 year, then SMU 3 years.
Rice and SMU. And Arlington State, too, man. Okay. And he didn't get through it, I think.
No, he never did get a degree.
No. Well, he got a real life degree because he had been bitten by the radio bug. Because out in 1929, in the summer of 29, they started building a plant a little bit southeast of where we are right now. And there it's under construction. This nice building that was promised to be in a sort of Spanish modernistic style. You can see behind the building taking place, there's a space for an antenna tower. Okay. There's some of the place under construction. That gentleman there, and I'm going to get my name right, is L.B. Henson. and he was their chief engineer. He's standing where one of the antenna towers were going to be. They planned on 2 giant towers, 300 feet tall, 700 feet across, 700 feet apart from each other. They figured that could get the station really heard. Plus, they had a new transmitter because on that 800 frequency, the government was permitting a 50,000 watt superpowered stations. That and a few other frequencies. And the WFAA intended to be the first station in the Southwest with this new superpowered transmitter that was literally 10 times bigger than the station they'd had before. If you'll notice this little road there, that is something that they were building from Dallas to Grapevine and on up north toward northwest towards Rome. They were calling it the Northwest Highway. And at this point, it was just a dirt road. But this, what the morning news promised, would be a fabulous motor trail all the way from Dallas to Grapevine and well beyond. And if you've ever wondered if Northwest Highway in Dallas and Northwest Highway in Grapevine, well, why do we have 2 roads the same? Well, they're the same road, or they were when it was built. So, there's, look, back up. There's the plant from the air. The local paper thought this was pretty impressive, so they actually ran a photograph in the paper. And look how much it was costing. The whole $270,000. Now, that was big money back then.
That's right.
And as it was finished, this is a final photo I just found the other week, and I'm really excited. It's the first time I've ever been able to see the 2 towers that were initially part of this in 1930. And it was going to go on the air, and it went on the air in May of 1930. And in fact, May 10th, I believe, is the right date, or 11th? Yeah, Saturday, May 10th. Remarkably, it was such a big deal that Fox Movie Tone newsreel, we didn't have news coverage on TV, but we did have newsreels. They came out and filmed the station going on the air. And that film survives. And I want to watch a little bit of that because we have the exact moment that this Grapevine transmitter went on the air. Actually, it's from the studio in Dallas. And so if you'll watch this, if I don't go past it, we'll get to watch this for a couple minutes. First up is George Dealey, the publisher of the Dallas News.
Represents our latest endeavor at such service. The new WFA is not our boast. It is our faith in our country. And the letters will continue to mean working for all alike.
It is now time for the Dallas Power and Light Company's program, to be known as Artist Hour, at the start of which station WFAA will switch to its new transmitter of 50,000 watts, the first superpower broadcasting station equipment of the South. Now you'll please stand by, and station WFAA at Dallas, 5,000 watts, now changes to its 50,000 watt transmitter.
You're deaf. Goes to the switch. Come right back to that. Once they got the word that the signal was coming through.
Station WFAA, Dallas, Texas, 50,000 watts. This is the Artist Hour of the Dallas Power and Light Company, the first program broadcast on station WFAA's superpower transmitter. Through the courtesy of the sponsors, we present to you as a guest of this studio at this time, the Governor of Texas, the Honorable Dan Moody.
When I contemplate this thing and the thought that my voice goes out in waves that I cannot see, that I cannot feel, but that can be picked up 100, yes, 1,000 and 5,000 miles from here, and reproduce to listeners that I have never seen and will never see, I cannot but marvel that these are great and wonderful times that we live in, and that God moves in a mysterious way His wonders to perform.
I never seen inside the school and the kids spelled over the cat. I ain't got nothing but mother wit, and I'm very much obliged for that. I don't know nothing but right and wrong, and I think that's just immense. But I ain't gonna leave no lines around, 'cause I got good common sense.
That was Mr. Peg Moreland, who was a huge air personality on WFAA. He was part of the early birds, and he knew, he was called the king of the ditty singers, knew thousands of songs and could sing any of them at a drop of a hat. That was May 10th, 1930, the very moment the station went on the air from its Grapevine location. And who was the person who did that? They're dead. You guys talk.
Some of the first programs they had were the Rabbit Twisters, and I'm sure y'all have heard of those gentlemen. That picture was made on the front steps of the radio station. My grandfather, Henry Willingham, and I think his dad may have played in that band. In fact, the Historical Society, the museum has the trumpet that he played. Mother kept that all in. We got it all those years and kept it, and then we donated it to the Historical Society. So part of that era was still there.
Your dad and his friend came right out of college to work at the station.
Yeah, my dad and Ray Collins was a good friend of his, and they both went to work for the radio station at the same time. And the radio station inside where the transmitters were a very dangerous area to be in if it was happened to be on the air. They shut it down at night for maintenance and turned everything off where they could go in there and work on things. And the amount of power in there, and RF reflection, the RF in the transmitters rooms.
Yeah.
You know, my dad always claimed that's where he got his cancer from, was from that high RF frequency and being around it so many years that that was part of his health issues.
Okay. One of the favorite things Dad would do is if you came out and toured the station, he would take you around. One of the things he liked to do was to go down to the base of the tower, and he had a long 4-foot fluorescent tube, and he would take it and hold it up and draw an arc off of the side of the tower.
A giant spark.
And it would be sparking and arcing, and you could actually hear the audio of the program that was on the air at that time being buzzed in the arc that he was drawing. And he would stand there and hold this, and the fluorescent tube would be lit. And he would stand there until he said, well, the soles of my feet are getting hot, and I think I better quit. That's when he quit doing it. But he would do it every time. I'm not sure that didn't have something to do with his subsequent cancers.
Tell them about them standing above the top of the tower. They had to stay down below the top of the rim because they
Yeah,
became part of the tower.
if somebody had to climb to the top of the tower, it was 653 feet up to the top platform. Then there was the 3-foot railing around it. Well, if you stood above that railing, you are now part of the antenna. And again, your soles of your feet would get hot. You would start radiating RF. Now, you wouldn't feel anything because you were at the same potential as the tower was. But again, the currents flowing through your body would cause the soles of your feet to get warm because you are now part of the antenna itself.
Get into the window.
Do I?
Go ahead. Yeah.
They when they had to replace those lights on those and on the radio towers, they had climbers that would climb on the outside of that tower. There was a ladder that went up to the center of that tower, those towers. But those climbers could climb it faster by climbing on the outside of it. And they made the wrong step or didn't hang on. They had safety belts, but that'd be the end of them. They also would bring a big crane out and they had a big ball on the end of that crane. Those guys would ride that big steel ball. It was
Called a headache ball.
called a headache ball. They'd ride that thing, and they'd take them up on, crane would take them up and let them off on certain levels of it. There were certain levels of the tire. But that was interesting. I remember in my young days, I wasn't born to 45, and Dad would let us go out there. They did it on midnights. Well, I'd rather been home asleep, you know, at that time in the morning. But it was interesting to watch them climb those tires. They'd put big floodlights up out there and light that tire up so you could go up on top of it and do work on it.
American Indians.
Yes, and the climbers were all American Indians. They wouldn't anybody else climb them but them. And I never did find out the story as to why they were the only ones that would climb them. But
The story I was told was they had no inherent fear of height, so it didn't make any difference to them. They'd climb and go anywhere and not worry about how high they were.
that's right. So, like I said, Jerry knows more about the radio station and the operation of it because I was still too young to know what all was going on. But I know Dad would take trips to check how far they could reach away from Grapevine with the signal. They'd take signal strength readings, and they had this gizmo that he'd set up out in the field somewhere. If we'd go to Oklahoma, Kansas, all around the area, 3 or 4 state area, this area, and take strength readings. And that was kind of like a vacation trip.
What we had to do was draw what was called a contour map. We would stop every so often at known landmarks, take a reading. We came back and we would connect all those points and form a circle. And that way, that was part of the proof of performance that the FCC required and had to accompany the application for renewal of the license. So I went on one of those things, and it was a week-long trip, and we went from here all the way down. We went down to around down on the Rio Grande, down in the valley, and stopping every so often at a landmark and recording the field strength there.
So it's quite an ordeal to keep all that stuff together. I'd like to stop right quick. If you're kin to me in some form or fashion, stand up. Anybody in here kin to me, stand up. Trigg, stand up. Okay. As you can see, we have quite a history in Grapevine. Thank y'all. Karen, you can stand up there. But in those early days, there wasn't a lot of people to marry. So you gotta be careful what you say in Grapevine because you never know who's kin to who. And sometimes somebody makes a comment and come to find out they were kinfolk. And Mayor Tate's one of our cousins. And some people didn't believe that, you know. I said, well, you can trace it back through the Willinghams. But we've been around here a long time. I never made enough money to leave. I had to stay here, so I'm still here.
I think we're kin to everybody.
I think we're kin to everybody. Yeah, if you're back here in those days, we probably are.
So, for the next 40 years, that station was located there. And that album with that picture in it is over here, among with some other artifacts from the various first 50 years of the stations. So if you want to come over afterwards and take a look, you can. Now, we've talked about that as if we said exactly where it was, and I think it's hard to imagine exactly where it really was. So let me orient you with a couple photographs. This is the station. This is a 1947, 1950-ish photo. The 2 old towers have been replaced by a new tower in behind the station, which was, when it was built, the tallest structure in the entire Southwest of any kind. 653 feet tall. It was put in 1937. And the station is up here in the front, and this road is the Northwest Highway. It's been finished. It was finished in 1932. We're looking kind of were kind of north and maybe a little east, okay? Now you're still going, well, I don't recognize that. Well, here's why. Here's the exact same location today. It is the northeast corner of the airport, and way up there is the new 114. Okay? It replaced the old one that didn't fit when the runways went in. Okay? Let me give you one more look at how that maps out, literally. Here's Grapevine. This, again, is a photo from the I think an aerial photo from about 1950, but not much had changed. Up in this corner, that's the Northwest Highway. Here's Main Street. We would be, here's the train station, so we're about here. Okay. This is the Northwest Highway. This is now Texas Trail. Then it curved. In the 50s, there was a drive-in movie theater here. Okay? Keep going down 3 miles. There it is. That little fork kind of shape there is the transmitter plant and that tower right there. Okay? Long way out, even from Grapevine. Let's look at it today. Very slow dissolve here. Very much unrecognizable, except that it's the same scale. There's Northwest Highway, there's Main Street, here's where we are, here's the turn right down there, okay? And if you look very carefully in this plot right there, there's a bit of curve, and there's the old highway right there. If you go on the access road of the highway here, and you get off and you park your car there, you walk up a little hillock, and you can get on that part right there, done it. So, and it kept going right down to about there, where the station was. Back to 1930, just for comparison purposes. 90 years makes a lot of difference.
So why did they tear it down?
The airport.
When the airport was built?
We'll come to that. Yeah, it was the airport. I don't know things.
Where it was on Highway 114 and County Line Road, if any of you remember that. And it was Otho Crocker's place was just to the west of it. And that's where the aircraft crashed, which I'll talk about in a little later, but maybe I'll orient some of you older people to remember those names.
Well, this is a good time to talk about that crash.
Oh, okay.
Let's do that, because we're about up to the 1940s.
Okay, yeah, we are. Okay, in 1942, it was October 16th, and it was sort of a dark, grungy, low cloud day. And back in those days, aircraft had very little navigation systems. Everything was IFR. It was called I Follow Roads, or I Follow Railroads. And that was the conditions that existed that day. There was an Army B-25, which was a twin-engine, twin-tail medium bomber, the one that Doolittle flew over Tokyo. If that remembers it, I got a picture of one up here. But there was one on a routine training flight, and he was supposed to go over south of here, and he couldn't because of the weather. So he landed at Love Field in Dallas, and the weather improved, so he took off, and he was going to fly IFR, I Follow Roads, in that case, Highway 114, over to Meacham Field in North Fort Worth. Well, you fly the aircraft from the left-hand side of the cockpit. So he would have flown, and the pilot would have flown and be looking out the window following the highway. He would have been south of the highway, and that's where the guy wires were that held the tower up. Well,
The clouds were really low that day.
Huh?
The clouds were really low. They said
They were
500
about
feet.
500 feet, yeah, because they hit about 500 foot level. He hit one wingtip, hit one of the guy wires, which ripped the wing off the plane. It spun down and crashed into the field just west of the plant. And of course, it killed everybody on board. And there were two people in the plant there at the time. Johnny Hemley, for those of you who remember Madeline Hemley, was her husband. He was on duty as the operator, and a guy named A.B. Bell, who was the maintenance guy. They went over there to see what was happening. Of course, there were no survivors, and they notified the Air Force and at that time Army Air Corps. They came out and secured the site. So there was no damage. The guy wire that they hit was 2¼ inches in diameter of steel cable. So you can see how heavy it was and how it took the blood of the force without cutting the cable. If it cut the cable, the tower would have collapsed. So that was a big thing for that day.
Right after they completed 114, or Northwest Highway to Dallas, I can remember Dad talking about when the Bear gang was in this area, they'd caught one of them somewhere around this area in Dallas County. They picked him up and taken him back to Dallas County. They stopped at the radio station to call in the Decker, and Bill Decker, who was sheriff, I guess, back in those days, and to tell them they'd called him, and they were bringing him, Raymond Hamilton, I think was that guy's name, that they called him and was taking him back in a car, but they didn't have radio contact with Dallas this far out, so they had to stop and use the telephone at the radio station to call them and tell them they had captured him and they were bringing him in.
They should have just done a news broadcast right from the transmitter.
I'm wondering if they didn't have it on the news. I'm sure it was later on.
Well, I'm sure it was.
But as far as the radio station has gone, it's missed. It should have been saved. I wish the city could have done something to kept part of that stuff from the radio station just for historical purposes. But the airport was hot to trot to get that airport built, and so they want it all gone. They just dug a big hole or imploded the thing into the basement. That radio station had a basement in it, which was very rare around here. And I can remember my dad was scared to death of thunderstorms. And anytime we had thunderstorms in the area, lightning and the thunder, we went to the radio. We got up and out of our house over on Texas Street, went to the radio station and went in the basement. And that's where we stayed till it all cleared up.
Because there were tornadoes nearby.
Oh yeah, it was, never get hit or anything, but I'll never remember having to get up in the middle of the night and Mother raised Cain with him. You don't need to get up and we're going to the radio station. So that was the safest place in this whole area for tornado protection, unless you had your own cellar.
The national broadcast.
Okay. Well, at this point we've talked pretty much exclusively about WFAA because for the first 10 years, that was WFAA's transmitter. WBAP had a smaller station still in Fort Worth, and this was WFAA's alone. By the way, that's their mobile unit, they had that, and I believe you were telling me that little antenna in the front of the station was for use with the mobile unit.
I think so.
So, and that sounds about right to me. Well, the stations were still sharing the frequency. WFAA had all the power, literally, but WBAP had the same frequency some of the time. They wanted it. They would literally, on an 18-hour day from 6 a.m. to 12 midnight, each had to be able to broadcast for 9 hours only. Then they went off the air. That was not sitting well with people. The 820 frequency was so desirable that particularly Eamon Carter decided he needed to get in on that more. This is some of the coverage from that station. The yellow marks where people were actually listening on a regular basis. Not a whole lot, but they were listening all the way up into Montana on a regular basis. They had listeners, the Light Crust Doughboys and all the network shows that went with it.
And Dale Evans sang on that.
Oh yeah,
Some studios in Dallas. Their studios were in Dallas and Fort Worth. There was no studio, nothing was transmitted from out here other than the power was all out here.
Yep, Dale Evans
studio in Dallas.
got her start as part of the early birds before she joined Roy Rogers.
Of course, the mayor of Dallas and the mayor of Fort Worth didn't get along with a hoot. If y'all remember those days when Amon Carter, they said he wouldn't even go to Dallas and eat lunch.
Yep.
Take sack lunch with him. He wouldn't eat in Dallas.
Well, the two stations, the two papers decided to collaborate just enough, and they came up with this unique arrangement. Amon Carter bought a station in Wichita Falls, KGKO. It was on the 570 frequency. Then he moved it down here. And then he proposed, okay, what if instead of going off the air completely, we just switch to the other frequency? So that when you're on 810, 820 by that time, and then it's time for us to go on, you'll just switch, we'll throw a switch, and you'll go over to the 570 frequency. And that's what they did. They actually both broadcast from that transmitter tower on the 820 dial with full power, and whoever wasn't on the air would go to the lower end of the dial on station 570. And they made that work for 30 years. As the line here says, it was confusing to everybody but the listener. And I think it was confusing sometimes to the listeners too, to be honest, because you never knew quite what you were on. They tried all sorts of things. I love this billboard. The 570 was lit when WFAA was on 570, and on the other side, when they were on the 820, they would light up that. So as you were driving past, you could know which station to tune to if you wanted WFAA at that particular moment. It was a very strange thing. And it was done multiple times a day by Paul Barnes, the plant supervisor, and the rest of the staff there. And you'll notice in this picture now, they've both got their call signs up on the door, essentially, at the entrance there. And that's, go ahead.
As a matter of interest to some of you who might remember, the radio station programs that you might listen to back there at that time was Young Witter Brown, Mary Noble, Backstage Life, Stella Dallas, and Bob Perkins. And these were the forerunners and called soap operas because they were all sponsored by Oxidol Laundry Detergent is one of them. It's still around, I think, today. But those were some of the stations I can remember listening to growing up because that's all there was on the radio.
And I still have this bent back chair that was KPKO, still got the call signs on the seat of it. When we have extra company come over to eat, I have to bring that chair in, so we got enough chairs for everybody to sit around and eat. But that chair is still in the
I think that's cool. Now, most of the programs were national programs. The kinds of shows that they're talking about, like the soap operas or the game shows or the evening, suspense, what they call the golden age of radio. No programs originated from this building 3 miles out of town. If there were local shows, they originated from either Dallas or Fort Worth. This is the Dallas studios starting in 1941 of WFAA. That's the Santa Fe building. We have a newspaper over there that from their opening, grand opening, they had a 200-seat theater. So if you wanted to go see the morning show, which was the early birds, kind of a early progenitor of today and all those shows with a live band and music and singing and poetry and all sorts of things, you could arrange to get your free tickets and go up the elevator and sit in that beautiful modern 200-seat auditorium. The Fort Worth station was up in the top of the Medical Arts building, and they didn't have a very lovely studio comparatively. They waited until 1948, and then they built a TV studio on the edge of Fort Worth, what we know as Broadcast Hill. That's the one people often think of right there. But that's where the programs themselves came from. And here is your dad, one more photo of your dad. It's hard to find him, but here he is at work in the Master Control Center at WFAA. Do you know roughly what he's trying to do there? I mean, other than pose?
I'm sure that was a staged picture. Dad didn't like the picture taken. He was a photographer. He took thousands of pictures of us kids when we were growing up. I think that's where Amy Martinez gets her eye for doing pictures. But he made a lot of photographs, and he had his own had a studio, and it was a combination photography lab and his ham radio
He
equipment.
was big in ham still.
Yeah, and that building is still in existence up on Texas Street. It's all 907 East Texas, a detached building from the house, and that was his radio room and shack.
Did he let you go on the air from there?
No, we could go out and listen and watch, but the jury probably did, but I didn't.
You nodding or shaking your head?
Well,
Sorry about that, Forrest.
I got my ham radio license, and Dad had let his lapse because he lost interest in it by having messed with it all the time. So when I got my ham license, he got his, and we resurrected the old, at that time was the photographic development studio, printing prints and developing film and whatnot, and that was Dad's hobby at the time. And when I came along and got my ham license, we converted it over to the radio shack, what we called it, installed our equipment back there. And Dad operated it until they moved it, and once they did, he had lost interest, and they turned it into, what is it now? It's a bedroom.
Yeah.
It's still out there, like I say, but it's been completely redone by now.
It's old fancy.
Yes, completely fancy.
From 1941 to 1970. That's what happened. Two stations stayed on the air from the transmitter out here. They switched frequencies several times a day, and radio changed underneath everybody's feet. All those shows that we're talking about got replaced by news and DJs and all that sort of stuff as television came along. Stations kept going. In fact, here's from 1964 a bit of the station WFAA and the moment it changes frequency.
This is WFAA 570 AM and FM in Dallas. The official U.S. Weather Bureau forecast for the Dallas-Fort Worth vicinity indicates cloudy skies with intermittent rain today and tonight. Mostly cloudy Friday with showers affecting about a third of the area. There will be no important temperature changes. The expected high today, mid-60s. The low tonight in the upper 50s, with the high Friday in the upper 60s and the winds light and variable.
This is November.
Officially under cloudy skies at Greater Southwest International Airport in Fort Worth. It's currently 59 degrees. It's also cloudy at Dallas Love Field with a temperature there of 60.
Next on 570 News, this is WFAA 570 AM and FM radio at Communications Center in Dallas.
Now it's not. That tone.
The broadcasting pioneer of the great Southwest, WFAA 820 AM FM Dallas, Clear Channel Radio, WFAA.
This is John Allen, WFAA Radio News, a service of Oak Cliff Savings and Loan Association, Texas' largest suburban savings institution, serving the saver.
And at the same time that was happening, back on WBAP, they rang cowbell to to announce the change of frequency, and they would have said, "This is WBAP 570."
Anybody ever listen to Bill Mack show? That's the same cowbell he had.
Yeah.
They still got that cowbell.
That cowbell is currently in the possession of WBAP in their museum. Well, by 1970, everybody had had enough of that agreement. And the morning news agreed to give up that 820 frequency and move down to 570. WBAP took over 820 and the big station, and that was great because at night, Bill Mack could be heard across the entire country, and every trucker at that point, he just started the BAP in 69, I think, and every trucker listened to Bill Mack for the next, gosh, how many decades? And they're still on that frequency and still 50,000 watts today, just more up in Northland. So that ended the frequency sharing unique thing like nothing else in the country. It also was the end of the transmitter and that facility because, as you said, the airport came along. There was no.
We also have proposed high-rise hotel in the center of the new Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport. This has been approved by the Dallas-Fort Worth Regional Airport Board. We also have WFAA, WBAP radio antenna towers that are to be relocated from their present position near Grapevine to a new location on the North Lake shores.
And that marked the end of it all. They put out a bid for those old tube transmitters, those giant 50,000 watt RCA transmitter and a smaller one, and they sold those off. And a couple years later, just before the year before the airport really opened, they just took a bid to demolish it. And as far as we know, they just pulled it straight down. And that was the end of it. That was the end of that story. And that's where we sign off as well. Thank you all tonight.